Hey guys, it's Fadra from All Things Fadra, and I am going completely off topic today, and I can do that because this is All Things Fadra. I'm normally covering cars, travel, entertainment, and some other cool stuff, so if you're interested in any of that, be sure to hit the subscribe button. But today, I'm putting on my parenting hat because I have a 14-year-old son who's getting ready to start high school. And guess what? Now is the time to be thinking about college. I know I've got 4 years to go, but if he wants to get into a good school, I need to be thinking about what colleges are looking for. And let me tell you, when I went to college years ago, my prep work involved doing an SAT course on my Commodore 64. Okay, so things have changed, and I haven't necessarily kept up with the college admissions world, but luckily I found an expert who is right in the thick of it. I am talking today with John Morganelli. He is former admissions director at Cornell University, and I asked a lot of my readers and a lot of my audience their burning questions about what they need to know to help their child get into college. And I'm not going to keep it all for myself. I'm going to share the highlights with you right here.
I think overall what we're finding is many of us, our familiarity with the college admissions process is based on our own experience, which it was likely 20 to 30 years ago. I did watch your video where you talked a lot about academic curiosity. And I thought that was really good and actually really interesting for me to hear. One of the statements I got from one of my readers was, we were told in 10th grade that it's junior year that really counts. And I think that's kind of a good segue to my first question, which is how early as a student and as a parent should you start thinking about college?
Sure, that's a great question. I think you need to have a foundation of understanding what it is that colleges and universities are actually looking for. And I think the biggest myth out there is that colleges and universities are looking for well-rounded students. They're fundamentally not looking for well-rounded students. They're looking for a well-rounded class, right? So when you get a great physicist, a great artist, a great historian, you bring them together, you develop a well-rounded class. The well-rounded student, the individual, when they appear well-rounded in an application for admission, the problem with that is that the application itself is a limited platform. You have 650 words on a personal statement, and then depending on the institution that you apply to, there's somewhere between 450 to 650 words for supplemental essays. And so on a very limited platform, you have a limited amount of time and space to describe your academic engagement and your academic interests. And a well-rounded student often only gets to a surface level of exploration in that application. And students who create depth in their application, focusing on one or possibly two things, stand to have a significantly stronger advantage in this process. From my perspective, when you think about what the colleges are looking for, you noted right away that I often talk about curiosity. That's the first quality I think they're looking for. The second is explorative, right? If you're curious and you have questions, they're looking for motivation that you actually will get up out of your seat and do something about it, explore it in some fashion. And then finally, the third quality is that the student is ready, willing, and able to contribute to this specific area of academia. So curious, explorative, and ready to contribute. And so getting back to your original question, which is when do you start? As you can imagine, a student who starts earlier, right, and has a defined area of focus earlier, they will clearly have an advantage in this process because they will come across as more curious because there will be deeper questions. They will come across as more explorative because they've had more time to actually layer engagement experiences in that area. And they will come across as more ready to contribute because as you create depth and specificity in the area of academia, the reader of the application has a better understanding of how that specific student will contribute to that specific department. And so you're differentiating yourself from the masses of kind of general applications.
Some students are coming from college prep schools and private schools. Some are coming from well-funded public high schools with a broad range of programs, and others are just coming from their local public high schools. How much does where a student come from matter? And how do colleges look at that? How do they look at, let's say, and we can maybe talk a little bit about GPA, because I know some of that gets into that with weighted GPAs and regular GPAs, and does a 4.0 at a highly competitive prep school mean the same as a 4.0 at a public high school?
Yeah, great question. I guess what I would say is that it's best to start with how your high school impacts the review process. Almost every single college in the country breaks up their admissions office by geography, right? So admissions officers will have specific states or territories that they are responsible for. And within that geographic region, most of the admissions counselors will review the applications by high school group, meaning that if 15 students apply from the same high school, they would prefer and often do review all of those 15 students together so they can have that context. And so certainly the school you go to, as it relates to the competition from the students who are applying to the same university as you are, that absolutely has an impact. And you could argue that a highly competitive high school that has highly competitive applicants might actually make it harder to get into a highly selective institution, depending on who from that high school applies and what majors they're applying to, and are they similar to yours. Again, if you kind of go to the public high school side on the other end of the spectrum, it's certainly true you could make the argument that in some instances, students that are doing well, but maybe not at the absolute top of their class, they may not get the same level of treatment of preparation as it relates to, as compared to, say, a student coming from a highly competitive private school. I think there are benefits and downsides to a public or private school, and it really depends on the specific student. But my general rule of thumb is, if you're super, super bright, I don't think it really matters, quite honestly. I think that highly selective schools find strong academic, passionate students. I think if you're a good, above average type student, certainly there is some value to being at a highly selective prep school, because highly selective schools will go a little deeper in the class at a highly selective prep school than at a public school.
Let's talk about SAT scores for a minute. In asking this question to my audience, I keep hearing about test optional schools, test blind schools, which kind of blew me away, because I'm still trying to get my head around the fact that you can use your calculator on the SAT. So, I mean, I'm very old school, where you took the SAT, probably, I think I took it 6 times trying to get a better score. Tell me how that factors into things these days. Yeah.
So one of the things I always say about higher ed is that it moves very, very, very slowly, and you don't see change come quickly. And often most institutions want to see other institutions that they consider to be peers, or maybe even higher level than peers, engage in changing of policies first before they follow suit. I was shocked by how quickly the dynamic on standardized tests changed post-COVID. Institutions had to change because students couldn't actually sit for the SAT or ACT. Most of them were closed, and to that end, all of the institutions were required to say, okay, we're moving forward with either a blind or optional strategy. What we found was that once that avalanche started, it just kept continuing. SAT subject tests, which used to be an important part of this process at highly selective institutions, have been just abolished completely. They're gone. The University of California has indicated they will no longer use SATs or ACTs in the future on a 3-year plan to get rid of them. And even the most selective schools in the country are having significant conversation about whether or not they will continue optional or blind policies. I think it is important to define the difference, though. A test blind policy means that no matter what, if you submit that test, they will not review it. And so there is no advantage to submitting the test. An optional policy means that it is, in fact, the student's option to submit. Historically, I would argue that majority applicants, from an ethnicity perspective, white students and Asian students, generally speaking, it wasn't really optional, right? 95% of the students who were being accepted amongst Asian and white students had submitted standardized test scores. If you look at the University of Chicago, that was test optional in advance of COVID, 90% of all of their enrolled students had submitted test scores. And when you look at the 10% who didn't, generally they were underrepresented minorities. I think we're seeing that dynamic change now. And I think that it certainly is a question as to whether or not majority applicants, Asian and white students, should in fact submit standardized tests to optional institutions. I guess my rule of thumb would be if you're below the 50th percentile of the institution you're applying to, it's probably not doing you any favors, and you might consider applying optionally. And that's not something I would have said 2 years ago.
So you're saying if it's a test optional school and you're in the 50th percentile, meaning you don't have great academics.
So if anyone were to do a quick Google search, if they were to say, Cornell University average SAT score, you actually get 4 numbers. You get a critical reading and math, right? So 2 numbers for each. The low number represents the 25th percentile of the institution. The high number represents the 75th percentile of the institution. And then, of course, the middle would be a 50th percentile. Generally, what I would say is if you're Asian or white and you're below that 50th percentile, and this gets complicated depending on what round you're applying, early decision versus regular decision versus early action. There's different accept rates and different ways of thinking about what the university is looking for in those different rounds. But generally speaking, below the 50th percentile probably is not going to do you any favors. And I would argue it probably makes sense to just not submit the standardized test and lean into the rest of the evidence on your application that you're ready.
What I heard from a lot of parents is, again, it's my generation going, wait, I don't have to submit my SAT scores. And they're thinking like, but is that really okay not to do that? But what you're saying is you got to be bringing something to the table. And maybe your SAT scores aren't it, in which case you can opt not to submit them, but make sure you have a strong application in other areas.
All colleges and universities want more applications, and they certainly all want more applications of underrepresented minorities. Eliminating standardized tests allows for that possibility of more overall applications and more standard and more underrepresented minority applications. So there is a reason that they might move into this optional space, and that will have impact to majority applicants like Asian and white students.
So are colleges going to be kind of taking into account that 2020 was the year that was, and hopefully we're putting it behind us, but I mean, mentally, emotionally, academically, kids weren't necessarily performing at their best level, and they may even be playing a little bit of catch up. How do they factor that in?
Great question. I think there's a misconception that the university, the admissions office, the director of admissions sets the standard. The standard is set by the competition, right? The other applicants that are applying in that specific year to your specific area of academic interest. And so to that end, it really depends on what school we're talking about and what level of competition you should expect. Even amongst my own client base, there's a wide variety of difference between the way students engage depending on where they're located in the world. And so I guess what I would say is that, of course, colleges and universities understand what the student went through, right? Because we all went through it, and it was a very, very, very difficult year in many, many ways. But in the end, if other students have been creative and engaged throughout this process, and some of them have done a lot of things virtually, started new organizations, I have clients that have focused, psychology students that developed groups that were focused on isolation issues amongst their peers, right? So students who got engaged and creative in this process, I think, actually have an advantage because of the fact that students who didn't do that didn't have as easy of access as they used to layering engagement. So overall, I would say, yes, the colleges understand, but as you move up the selectivity rank, it doesn't necessarily matter because the competition will have creatively engaged through this process.
Let me ask you about extracurricular activities. And I know this is going back to the well-rounded student where you have to do community service and you have to be in clubs and play an instrument. When it comes to extracurricular activities, how engaged are they looking for students to be? Is it the number of activities? Like I hear athletics and sports. How important are those? If a student has a job, is that considered an activity? How is that factored in?
Yeah, great question. I actually just wrote an article on my website and posted on my blog. It was actually about the power of guidance counselors, but it noted that many times, like all the questions I generally get is, how did that student get in? And oftentimes parents, before I even get a chance to answer, will kind of rattle off the things they think it was. You know, they were first chair of the orchestra, they were captain of the basketball team, and I would say generally, right? Engagement needs to be connected to your area of academic interest. In all honesty, no one cares that you played a sport. No one, literally in college admissions, cares that you played a sport unless you plan to play that sport at the collegiate level. Is it a nice little add-on if every single thing else in that application is strong and illustrates your ability, your curiousness, your explorative nature, your ability to contribute in that specific area of academia? If you have all that and you happen to be the captain of the basketball team, maybe the most smallest of bumps. But generally, music, athletics, art, they provide almost no real value if the student isn't planning on engaging in those experiences at the collegiate level. I think getting out there in your community is really important, as long as it's connected to what we're talking about in your application narrative. The job in high school, I think, actually does provide value. It comes across as very genuine, right? So even if it's not connected to your area of academia, I think generally a job where you can learn life skills can add some value.
I did want to ask about early decision and what is early decision like these days? And does that have a big impact on acceptance?
Absolutely, yes. It's
okay.
You know, the fact of the matter is colleges created early decision because they wanted to lower their acceptance rates, right? The only way you can have a lower acceptance rate is to know that the students you're accepting are going to come. And that's what early decision is. Okay. And so we've seen institutions dip their toe into early decision back in the mid 1970s, 1980s. And now we see institutions significantly more than dipping their toe. University of Pennsylvania, for example, Ivy League institution takes over 50% of their class in early decision. So if you're a regular decision applicant in that pool, 50% of the spaces are gone. If you're a regular decision applicant in that pool who happens to be white or Asian and come from a high socioeconomic area, you have to understand that most of the students that they took in early decision fall into that category. So colleges don't have quote unquote quotas. I've never seen that, but they have an awareness of what they did in ED, right? And they're trying to fill holes in regular decision. If you look like just all the students that applied in ED and you're in the RD round, you probably aren't getting in. So ED is super important. And I think having a strong ED1 and ED2 strategy is very important for majority applicants of Asian and white students.
The question that probably is what you want to talk about the most, or what you want to talk the most about, is admissions counseling, which is what you do. What I got asked is, if resources are limited, where is money best spent? And specific quote, for example, in my day, we all took an SAT prep course, but no one had essay coaching. So if someone's saying, how do I, and I'm kind of struggling with, are we preparing the student for admissions, or are we preparing the parents for the admissions process? Because it sounds like both of those are kind of needed. So what should parents and students be doing? Should they be looking at a third-party college counselor? Should they be working with their guidance counselor, career college or career counselors at high school? What should they be doing?
Sure. Well, let me just first say, and again, this is the article I just posted on my blog, even students who hire me specifically, a lot of families, I think that they don't need their guidance counselor anymore, and that's fundamentally not true. Guidance counselors are very important because they have the ability to literally pick up the phone and call the admissions office and advocate on behalf of the student, and they do. Across the country, at almost every selective school, there are periods of time where guidance counselors will literally schedule calls and get a sense of how their applicants are doing, and in many instances advocate on behalf of specific students to that specific institution. So guidance counselors are important. And I will also add that if you are on the wait list, one of the most effective ways to get off the wait list is advocation from the guidance counselor from your high school. In this day and age, if you don't have a strategy, and you probably are at a huge disadvantage in this process as relates to applying to highly selective institutions. So I think college coaching from an early age can provide a significant value. Standardized test prep used to be almost a required aspect of it, because if you didn't get that test prep, you would just get filtered right out of the process. You know, if you didn't hit a certain score, not that they didn't read your application, but they read it with a perspective that made it very likely you were not going to get in. I think that's changing. And so, you know, I think that the narrative, the story of who you are, what you'll contribute to this community has become even more important as standardized tests start to move away. So I think college counseling can be very valuable, but I'll just put a disclaimer. I mean, one of the reasons I ended up in college counseling after a decade of working in college admissions at 3 different institutions was, you know, I would get calls from independent counselors. In fact, we used to actually have independent counselor tours where we'd invite the independent counselors to our institution and tell them everything about our institution. And the calls and questions I would get made me believe that these independent counselors were really not qualified, to be honest with you, to answer college admissions questions. Most of them have never read an application for admission. If they have, they often have read it kind of from a perspective of a seasonal reader, meaning that mostly selective schools hire part-time people to filter applications in the fall because we don't have enough people to actually read all the applications. So they were either guidance counselors that saw one high school, right, or a seasonal reader that saw the very beginning of this process. But in the end, the way decisions are made, this is strategic and structured, right? The colleges aren't willy-nilly making decisions. There's an audit process at the end. After you read all the applications, we go back and audit the decisions to determine, have we met the institutional priorities set out by our leadership of the institution? And if we didn't in those decisions will be changed before they go out the door. And so I think the insight that I provide is really significant and different, quite honestly, than almost every other independent counselor in the country. I'm sure there's a few others, but not too many. And I think most of the counselors could benefit from at least reading one application for admission. So I would encourage your audience to at least ask the question of, have you ever read an application for admission? Do you know what an institutional priority is? If the answer is no to either of those questions, I think they probably are not qualified to actually provide the advice.
Is there anything that any message or anything that you want to get out there that I haven't asked you?
Well, I think one of the really important parts of this, I think I started by saying a little earlier that I think the beginning of this process for a student is to identify the college to which they're applying to. Once you identify that college, arts and sciences, business, or engineering, we now have a direction of things that need to be accomplished in order to be successful. The second part of that is, what I like to get a sense of is, especially for younger students, they don't know exactly what they want to do, but give me the universe of possibility of how you want to spend your time. 90% of my clients come to me mostly interested in computer science or pre-med. It's usually what I start with. And what happens is, and I think this is really important for students and families to understand, it's out there that pre-med and computer science are highly competitive. And of course, there are other areas that are highly competitive. And I get the question all of the time, well, why don't we just apply to a less competitive program? And just to be clear, there are lots of less competitive programs. If you want to study Greek literature or the classics or soil science at Cornell, all of those are significantly easier to get into. But what happens is when you lower the threshold of competition, and the competition threshold, when I say competition, I mean standardized tests, rigor curriculum, that will all be lower in the measures I just noted. But the bar of evidence that you need to illustrate to the admissions officer that you're actually interested in Greek literature will be higher, because we immediately think, are you really interested in Greek literature? And so you need to be committed from the very beginning to what we refer to as underrepresented majors. Most students won't do that. And I also don't even recommend it, because why would you want to spend 3 years of important time in high school engaging in stuff you have no interest in just so you can possibly get into a highly selective college? The smart direction is, I'm interested in pre-med, I'm interested in computer science. Let's make a small move, a small strategic change that allows you to continue to kind of engage in those areas, but also will lower the level of competition. Computer science students, I generally would move to something like data science or info science. A pre-med student, which isn't even a major, I would move to something like public health. Just that minor change would increase your chances probably tenfold at most institutions, because pre-med is, you're probably at a highly selective institution in a College of Arts and Sciences, you could have as high as 40 to 50% of the applicants identify themselves as quote unquote pre-med. And so if you do that, identify yourself as pre-med, you will be compared to all of those students. So it's about strategic changes as it relates to your prospective major. It allows you to explore what you want to do, but also provides you a competitive advantage in this process.
Okay. My son is 14 and he's only started looking at, he's gone from this, he wants to do this, he wants to do this, he wants to do this. He's definitely going to be well on his way before he's on his way.
Mm-hmm.
But, in his mind, he's like, I want to go to Harvard. I'm like, well, why do you want to go to Harvard? Mm-hmm. Because it's Harvard. I'm like, no, you want to figure out what you want to study. And then you want to find the best school for the thing that you want to study. So, sure. And, a little cheaper wouldn't be bad either. We'll see.
Well, I will tell you, as it relates to financial aid, the more selective the institution, generally, the more financial aid they will give for need-based. The more selective the institution, the less merit scholarship they will give. So depending on where you fit as an individual, that kind of impacts that part of the decision. I'll just add, because I have to, because this is like on my heart as it relates to financial aid. I feel like this is something that no one really understands. Every single college calculates an expected family contribution, just like the FAFSA does, right? Expected family contribution. You hear this term EFC all the time. The key here is that every institution calculates it differently, right? So since they all calculate it differently, your financial aid package will be different at every institution depending on their institutional priorities. And so recognizing that and doing the work, and when I say the work, I generally think the net price calculator is a fantastic tool if you understand how to use it, of going in and finding institutions that have institutional priorities that fit your financial profile, right? So some institutions are focused on low-income families. Some institutions are focused on widely distributing their aid so they can get higher income families. Identifying that through your own specific process of doing the net price calculator can pay significant dividends, because what happens is students apply to college, they get, apply to 10 schools and they get accepted to 3. And if those 3 happen to be the poor financial fit schools, then the family's in a really difficult financial situation. If you do the work in advance, you can guarantee that the schools, any of the schools that you get admitted to, are strong financial fits so that you're not in that situation at the end.
So what is a good way to research that? Because that did come up. I had someone specifically say, how do you know if financial assistance is available beyond families considered in need? And the reason they brought this up is because the formula of expected contribution, their words, from families is a joke and not realistic for most families, especially if you have other kids.
Yeah, that's probably true, and probably a very frank way of saying it. I think the best way to do it is to, when President Obama was in office, he required, as part of some legislation, that every institution put on their website a net price calculator. Most of them went with the College Board's version of it. And so if you fill it out once, you can use that same information for all of the institutions. And so put all your information in, check out, 50 different schools if you wanted. Some of the really selective schools decided to create their own, like MIT, which makes it a little more annoying because you have to redo everything. But it's a worthwhile exercise.
Okay. All right. That's good to know that that's there. I asked you in the beginning, how early should you start thinking about college? And clearly, I'm at the right age and stage to be thinking about it for my, rising freshman here. So this has been really, really helpful. And I know that there are a lot of people out there that I was really kind of surprised. People who have students that are going to be seniors still going, I have no idea what to do. So There's definitely a need for some guidance here. And I think this has been really, really helpful.
I just want to say a quick thank you to John Morganelli. He was a fantastic resource, generous with his time and with his knowledge, which I hope has given you a little bit of insight. If you are like me, getting ready to get into the thick of it, maybe you feel a little bit more prepared now. If you have any other questions, be sure to leave me a comment and I'll be sure to try and get an answer for you. But in the meantime, hit that like button, maybe hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you next time.